Let's just look backwards to a year ago. Most people thought Russia would take Ukraine, Kyiv would fall quickly. We're now a year on. There's a lot of uncertainty about how this plays out. Can you give us your broad overview of the current trajectory and what factors you find most compelling?
Yeah. And by the way, I was one of those who got the invasion wrong. I remember saying to my wife, who used to work with me in defence, 3 days, the Russians will be in Kiev. And I wasn't alone. The chairman of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff in a closed session of Congress said that. It shows, by the way, and we need to think about this, if we can get the Russian military so wrong, despite modern intelligence methods, can the same problem occur with China? Because they're quite similar in terms of conscripts, rotten logistics, and corrupt defence industry. The Chinese are. It's worth thinking about. Look, where we are now is it's difficult to see an ending to this, a denouement. Some people are talking about Zelensky must win. I need to come back to that because you cannot decisively win over a country with 1,500 strategic nuclear warheads and 4,500 more in reserve. The other one is that Putin will win. Well, that would be an absolute disaster, which we need to explore, by the way, for the balance of power in Europe and for the future of Europe as a cohesive geopolitical entity. Both Zelensky and Putin have red lines over which they will not want to cross. Zelensky he wants the occupiers, a phrase he used quite correctly, totally out of Ukraine. I understand that. My view is very firmly that Putin will not deliver on getting out of Crimea, and we can discuss the reasons for that. Putin's red line he announced over a year ago when he got his foreign ministry to write an international agreement in very formal United Nations type language in which it was proposed that NATO, led by America, would commit itself to never, ever allowing Ukraine to be a member of NATO. Well, you and I know America and NATO ain't going to do that. So my bottom line is, this is a standoff. I'd like to say there's a resolution. I can't see a negotiated one. How does Putin negotiate with somebody who represents a country that, quote, does not exist, unquote? And how does Zelensky negotiate with a man who's created such extreme human rights abuses, torture, rape? So I think we're in for a prolonged period of standoff.
One of the big questions, of course, is international commitment to continuing to support Ukraine and, if necessary, escalate that support so that Ukraine cannot just keep fighting, but prevail. And taking into account everything you've said about the obstacles to that happening, that still needs to be the objective, presumably, for supporters of Ukraine. So what do we know at the moment? What have you managed to read into the firmness of international commitment to Ukraine? What did we learn, do you think, from Biden's visit? How symbolically significant was that? And what do you think the international community's preparedness is to escalate the support if necessary, including allowing Ukraine to actually strike into Russia?
Look, the continuing NATO support of Ukraine is crucial. Ukraine cannot fight this war by itself. And unlike Russia, it doesn't have a massive defense industrial base to resupply. You've seen how careful Biden in particular has been about tanks. Fighter aircraft still remain a no-no. And that's about him seeking to send signals to Vladimir Putin that we're not going to be allowing the Ukrainians to strike deeply into your territory. Having said that, without American assistance, the Ukrainians, I think it was just before Christmas, struck the Engels strategic nuclear bomber base about 300 kilometers from Moscow, a place called Saratov. You can see why America, who's playing a very sensitive game, is controlling the reach of weapons. Having said that, you've seen how brilliantly successful and impressive are American weapon systems like HIMARS, the very sophisticated long-range artillery system, with a range for the Ukrainians, I think, of something like 150 kilometers. I think the version we're getting, and I stand corrected on this, is a minimum of 500 kilometers. And you've seen how inaccurate and lousy the Russian systems have been, and how overwhelmingly impressive the American ones have been. And I do hope Xi Jinping is taking notice. Your question about Biden and Kiev, you've got to admire the secrecy with which the Americans did that. We were, most of us, gobsmacked. My understanding is it was held in a very tight group of people in, state, the White House and the Pentagon. And several hours before Biden's plane took off, Washington advised Moscow, our president is going to be visiting Kiev. In other words, watch yourself. The newspapers say that the Americans put an AWACS, an early warning system, above Ukraine as the president was flying in to Warsaw. By the way, and then this 80-year-old president had to be in a train for 10 hours. I mean, look, there's a lot of criticism about him, and he can look, and he and I are not dissimilar ages. When he bounces onto the stage and pretends to run, you think, don't do that, you're going to fall. And he can be quite, I don't know, he's not sort of losing it, but he's gentle, excessively so. But you've just heard him say two vital things yesterday in Warsaw, with the group of 9 East European former members of the Warsaw Pact aligning together against Russia. He said, in answer to a question, that as far as he was concerned, Article 5 of NATO, which is an attack on one, is an attack on all. By the way, we have no such article in the ANZUS Treaty. Article 5 of NATO said the President of the United States is a sacred commitment of the United States. And he repeated that, sacred commitment. Well, hey, if that doesn't send a signal to Putin, what will? And then later on, Biden said in the same speech, we will not sacrifice 1 inch of NATO territory. Now, these are very precise markers. And he was obviously not doing it off the cuff. And that must cause Putin to think more than twice, I would hope.
Do you think Putin can still plausibly believe, at least in his own mind, that Western commitment will eventually fade and crumble because the West is fundamentally weak and uncertain and all the rest of it? Or, I mean, because that really is Putin's only way out of this, isn't it? It's that eventually international commitment erodes. Can he still remotely count on that?
And he wants to see a climb down by Zelensky and some sort of, I was going to say negotiated agreement, but again, I just find that impossible to pin down. Look, getting inside Putin's mind is no easy task. I mean, when I was in the intel game in the Cold War, the Americans, used to write top secret code word documents, which we had access to in Canberra, saying the view of the Soviet leadership is, and there was a particular episode in 1983 when the Americans nearly miscalculated just how seriously the Soviets thought a surprise nuclear attack would be. It was to do with Able Archer, a NATO exercise in 83. It was so bad that 3 years later, PIFIAB, the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, wrote a damning report that said, the CIA did not warn you that the chairman of the Communist Party, Andropov, former KGB head, actually believed that in 83 there would be a surprise disarming American nuclear attack. And you CIA people wrote things like, our view is that the Soviet leadership does not think like that at all. Question mark, said the PIFIAB, how do you know you had no agents inside the Kremlin? Now, at least with the Soviet period, there was a Politburo. You and I would call it a cabinet. Putin does not have a Politburo of ministerial advisors. He is the Tsar of all the Russias, and is increasingly, if you noticed, isolated, including physically. You remember the long table meeting with Macron? Yeah. So I don't know whether it's getting through to him at all. His most recent speech, yesterday in Moscow, on the eve of the anniversary of the invasion, is not worth reading, by the way. It's 20 pages. He raves on about the weaknesses of the West, and he quotes the LBGT stuff. He quotes that the Church of England wants to nominate genders for God, and he said, "Dear God, please forgive them." And you've got to remember, he also plays the Russian Orthodox theme. He has his own patriarch. This is a man who was a KGB lieutenant colonel who had to be an atheist. So he's quite capable of doing what we used to call lateral arabesques, changing 180. So the answer to your question is, I don't know whether it's getting into his mind or whether he actually does believe that the West is decrepit and rotten.
That's all presumably very domestically focused, right?
Yes.
I mean, he's basically saying to Russians, the West is, yes. It's
Aren't you lucky to be with me?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I just want to return for a moment to something you were saying before about US supplies of weapons to date. Are you suggesting, do you think that they are currently giving Ukraine sort of just enough to push back on Russia without going too far? And what's the possible trigger for Americans sort of removing that restraint?
Yeah. The answer is yes, I do think the Americans are deliberately manipulating this. That must be hard for Zelensky to swallow, and he showed some irritation. The issue is the obvious one. It's the one that I mentioned earlier. You have commentators here in Australia saying, we, meaning the West, we need to see Russia decisively defeated. I come back to, when you've got that number of strategic nuclear warheads, and there's no doubt in my mind, and this has not been soft on Putin, but if he's cornered and humiliated by, for instance, the capacity of Ukraine to strike Moscow, for argument's sake, it's only about 400 kilometers from the northern border of Ukraine to Moscow. Putin might just pull the house of cards down. Now, we've got to be careful not to be blackmailed by him. But see, Kissinger, and he's still a man I admire, he's even older than me, has said quite recently, there must be a way out for Ukraine in this, and there must be a way out for Russia. And my view is, you cannot pretend that Russia will disappear. Europe is going to have to deal with a damaged, weakened Russia, in my personal view, or an even more angry Russia. And that is going to be a hard one for the Europeans to swallow. Finally, coming back to the supply of weapons, America's rock solid on this. So is Warsaw, Poland, a member of NATO. So is the UK. But just have a look at where the Germans and the French are. Now, Macron comes this one about there has to be a future for Russia, but he seems to be, wavering. And as for the Germans, they've come a long way, which I admire. They're going to double their defense expenditure, just like Japan. But you've seen how they drag their feet on tanks. And Germany, in the Cold War had the reputation of being the weak link because it was fundamentally infiltrated by Soviet agents.
That very exquisite balance between not pushing Putin into a corner where he might do something unthinkable, but not allowing ourselves to be blackmailed either. That really is that goes to the heart of strategic thinking and all of the imponderables associated with it. But do you have any guidance, any thoughts on how to manage that very delicate balance so that we get to the right point where neither of those things happen?
Look, even I have some limitations on this one. In the last 12 months, I've virtually done nothing else but Russia and Ukraine. And by the way, thanks to ASPI, with your brilliant speed of publication, you're much better than the academics.
An excellent report.
Timeliness is of the issue on this. I fear that this might unravel really badly. I don't want to play the woe and doom thing, you'll all be ruined, said Hanrahan. But you've seen that the nuclear scientists with the atomic clock have now put it to something like 3 seconds before midnight. which they claim is the worst it's ever been. And I can't remember whether it was still in being in 62 and the Cuban Missile Crisis. I just can't remember that. But in any case, I do remember in the Cold War where things got bad, 1983, first nuclear strike. So they're saying this is extremely dangerous. Putin is playing the nuclear thing like a violin. Unlike America, he's got a couple of thousand tactical nuclear warheads. The Americans have 280, mainly on airplanes. He's got artillery shells that are tactical nuclear. He's got torpedoes. He's got landmines. Now, the big question, if I might be a bit cynical, is what happens if they don't explode? Because the rest of his military is fairly crap. Really is. And we've got it wrong. So I think the bottom line is, to try and answer your question, I think they're going to stumble through another year of high-intensity, brutal, conventional war. And there is no end in sight for any negotiated solution. And in the meantime, Putin is playing with fire with things like suspending the New START agreement for strategic nuclear weapons.
Can you just give us your thoughts on the significance of that? By the way, the idea of an unexploding nuclear strike that doesn't go off, that's a whole different level of in-between greyness, isn't it? It's I don't know, how do we respond to that? But anyway, your thoughts on New START and the significance of...
Look, I spent nearly 2 decades of my life in defence, being in charge towards the last 5 or so years of defence policy on Pine Gap, and another joint facility near Woomera called Narunga, as well as our joint American submarine communication facility. But the prize one was Pine Gap. I had that clearance for 13 years, half of that as a professor at the ANU. It is one of the most tightly held secrets we have. Even in America, at the height of the Cold War, people had got the product, but they didn't know where it had come from. We used to negotiate at the level of Director CIA, Director NSA, Director DIA, Deputy Secretary of Defense, Deputy Secretary of State. It was really good stuff. I miss it. Pine Gap helps the Americans to be confident that there will be no surprise nuclear warning from the Soviet Union, because Pine Gap gazes at Russian ballistic missile silos, can detect their launch, can detect the telemetry, and therefore come to a judgment about target and impact point and the size of the warhead. Narunga, which has now been associated into Pine Gap, is a infrared device that detects the plume of the ICBM as soon as it's lit. And so, as we explained in the 87 white paper, we have full knowledge and concurrence of what goes on in Pine Gap. There's a lot of talk about sovereignty right now, is there not? Well, we negotiated that in 87, full knowledge and concurrence. It's vital to America's confidence of early warning. And early warning means, with an ICBM, you've got about 40 minutes, if you're lucky. With a submarine-launched ballistic missile, it depends upon how close in you are. But that's, you're talking of tens of minutes. What we've seen dismantled in recent years, now I won't go into the ins and outs and whose fault it was, is the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty was cancelled. The Theatre Nuclear Forces Agreement in Europe, Intermediate Nuclear Forces, was cancelled. By the way, the Soviets had to destroy 1,800 theatre nuclear missiles for that agreement. That's cancelled. The Open Skies Agreement is cancelled. And now we've seen Russia suspend, not cancel, the only international counting rules game that we've got. And it is a very serious thing, because the Russians for the last 2 or 3 years with COVID have used that as an excuse not to allow American intrusive inspections under New START. Intrusive inspections means going to the silo sites, going to the factory and count the number of missiles being made. It is that important. We're now in a situation, and I don't want to be melodramatic, that is the worst situation I've been in since the very height of the Cold War. And who would have thought we'd have come to this?
The latest suspension, is he using that as part of his manoeuvring on Ukraine? How does it actually relate, do you think, to his positioning?
Is manoeuvring and using classic KGB activities, desinformatia, Go need to translate it, and put the pressure on the Americans. But you've seen how Biden has responded in a way that Putin could not have foreseen. In Kiev itself, with all the potential dangers that implied, and the commitment to NATO, Article 5, and so on.
I'll ask one last question that relates to the relationship between Russia and China. We've had Wang Yi visit Moscow, I think, overnight, and Putin talking about that. We're expecting a visit from Xi Jinping to Moscow as well. You wrote in the report that you did for ASPI last year that that this is one of the most troubling implications of the current sort of international trajectory. What's your sort of update on the way that relationship is progressing, and what would be the implications of China's supplying Russia with advanced weaponry at this point in the conflict?
Yeah. I think I wrote for ASPI when I wrote that paper on the Russia's relations with China that it is a de facto alliance. It isn't NATO. It's not that sort of commitment. But, a lot of people, particularly in Europe, underrated it, and in this country. I mean, what brings them together? One is a communist country, one is a former communist country. They're both autocracies with very strong, domineering leaders, totally in control. They both hate the West. They both believe the West historically undermined them. They believe that now is the time to move. Particularly Xi Jinping says, we were humiliated in the 19th century, the Opium Wars. Time is now on China's side. It is China's time to maneuver. And he says that in relation to Taiwan, which for us, by the way, when push comes to shove, dare I say it, for Australia, is more important than Ukraine. They met, the pair of them, do you remember, last year, just before the invasion, and we still don't know whether Putin advised Xi Jinping. You would have thought so, given the closeness. I mean, they're doing very close joint military exercises together. They're rendezvousing nuclear strategic bombers over the East China Sea and loitering over both Taiwan and Japan. And to answer your question about arms supplies, so far it's been the other way around. So traditionally, the Russians have supplied advanced fighter aircraft like the Sukhoi 35, the modern, quiet, on Russian standards, but not on ours, relatively quiet conventional submarines. Perhaps one of the world's most advanced air defense systems. And the Russians have been building a ballistic missile early warning radar for the Chinese. That's serious stuff. But now we're getting the Secretary of State saying very carefully, Americans have evidence. And now I haven't seen that. And there's a limit to what China can usefully supply, in my view, because a lot of their kit, while some of it is, we think, is impressive, has been built on Russian designs. So I would have thought one of the most important things, as parochial as it is artillery shells, drones, and tactical missiles. And the Chinese can make lots of those and have got big production lines. Now, will that totally change the balance? No, it won't, as long as the West, which is struggling, as you know, to keep up the supply of tens of thousands of artillery shells. I saw something that said the Ukrainians are using 7,000 artillery shells a day. You're nodding your head. Well, if that's true, the anti-tank missiles Javelin that they've supplied to Ukraine, the Americans have lost half their stockpile. So how much longer can this go on from the West's point of view?
Yeah, but it gives the Russians an extra degree of bottomlessness to their beyond their own industrial base.
Yes, it does.
Make a practical effect.
And we mustn't underrate this Chinese relationship. Final words. In addition, with the sort of stuff that I've articulated that the Russians have supplied to China, we, the Australian ADF, may face Sukhoi 35s, Kilo-class submarines, and the S-300 air defence system in the South China Sea.